Hey, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I'm fortunate enough to direct our environmental change and security program, the host for today's session. I do see a few new faces, and so I want to just say a word about the Wilson Center, where we're sitting, before we jump into today's discussion. We're actually at the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. He was our only president to have a PhD. And so the Congress in 1968 thought it appropriate to set up a living memorial where those worlds of scholarship and research could come together with the worlds of policy and practice, learn from one another on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis, and have a productive exchange that we try to do here at the Wilson Center. Our environmental change and security program is a program that has been around since 1994, focusing on bringing those worlds together, but in the areas of environment, population, health, development, along with foreign policy and even security policy at times. And so naturally today's discussion in terms of demography and various carbon profiles of the future are part of what fits very much in that. We have the good fortune to be supported by USAID in these endeavors, and it's terrific to see folks from that agency here. And we come at these topics from a lot of different directions. We have had a number of conversations on climate change and that security agenda. We've had a number of conversations about climate change, adaptation, development challenges, how integrated health, population, conservation, so-called PHE programs are part of addressing some of those challenges on adaptation to poverty and some of the real challenging integrated development issues that are likely to result or resulting from climate change. So we've looked at these from a variety of different perspectives. Today we are very fortunate to have Brian O'Neill with us. Brian, as you know, is at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, a lead author for the IPCC, post in the EASA in Luxembourg, where he's heading up some of the population programs there. Brian is a scientist who we're fortunate to be welcoming back to the center. Somebody who has looked at a variety of different demographic profiles and trying to understand what changes in that realm may mean for various carbon scenarios. So we are keen to hear from him today about some of his new research that's underway and ongoing, to understand from a variety of different perspectives, from urbanization, aging, population growth rates, a variety of different angles and different ways to model some of these futures and what they might mean for carbon, so that we can build from that foundation, that scientific understanding, and go forward and try to address some of these challenges. And so that's our job today, to have this kind of foundational scientific presentation, understanding what some of the new research is on these critical topics, and use that as a basis in all our various guises and portfolios and where we're all sitting to go forward and use that information. We are webcasting today's event, so when it comes time for the Q&A, my colleagues will bring around a microphone. So if you could speak into that, the folks online can hear that. Folks online, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do that to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and particularly if you do it early in the meeting, we'll try to get that into the discussion. But once again, thank you all for venturing out on a very hot day. I was just outside, and I can attest that it's quite warm in April in Washington, perhaps appropriate context for today's discussion. So Brian, why don't we turn the floor over to you?
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. Yeah, and I think we do have an appropriately warm day. And I'm glad that the invitation to return to the Wilson Center didn't expire. So I think it was a little more than 2 years ago that I was here last to talk about population and emissions and some early pieces of the work that I'll present today. And at that time, I think I said, well, I think we'll probably be done with the global analysis in 6 months or so, something like that. So here it is 26 months later, and we're finally getting there. That means that some of you, I'm sure, have heard at least some pieces and maybe some substantial pieces of this before as it has evolved over the last 2 years. But hopefully there will be something new. I also want to thank everybody actually for coming. I know that I'm competing with Tiger Woods teeing off in the Masters today, so I'm actually shocked. I guess actually he teed off a little earlier, so if it was an hour or two later, I might have been in trouble. So if I hear people's phones and text messaging going off, I'll know you're getting updates, which is fine, as long as you share them at the question session. Okay, why don't I jump in? I'll switch presentations here. And first, I'd like to make clear that what I'm going to talk about is a work of a whole bunch of people, a team of people that have been working on this for a while, not just me, and also from a number of institutions. So although I'm at NCAR now, a substantial amount of this work was done while I was personally at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, or IASA, in Austria. Several of the team members are still there, and you see them listed up here. One member of the team, Lei Wen Jiang, is actually here, over there, terrific. And I will be deflecting difficult questions over that way, so be ready. Lei Wen works with us now at NCAR, but up until last year was with Population Action International, where he carried out a good piece of this work. And also Mike Dalton, who's the economist that works with us, is at NOAA. So before jumping into the specifics, I want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page about what we're talking about when talking about population and climate change. So here's the thumbnail sketch of the climate issue. No fancy graphics on this one. Maybe I should have a picture of the Earth from space. That's the typical thing here to stick in the middle. But I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with the basic issue. We have a number of human activities, mainly production of energy from fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, and also deforestation, and some other activities that lead to emissions of various kinds, change the composition of the atmosphere in a way that affects climate. Some of those climate changes are anticipated to have impacts that will then affect ecosystems and society as well. And we want to look at demography as a part of this, and there are really two principal ways that demography interacts with the climate issue, and I'm only going to talk about one of them, but I want us all to keep in mind that it is only half the story. Demography is a factor both as one of the determinants of emissions from human activity, but also one of the determinants of how impacts will affect human society. So that's one thing we want to keep in mind. The other is that when we're talking about demography, we're talking about a whole bunch of stuff, as Jeff mentioned, beyond the somewhat traditional focus on population size and growth rates. So growth rates and size matter, but a number of other things matter as well. On the left here, we have a set of what are often called compositional factors. They're aspects of the mix of different types of people or living arrangements of a given population. Age structure, living arrangements meaning household size or the age composition of particular households, whether they're multiple generations or not. Urbanization, spatial distribution, and there are others. There are also more, in a way, sort of more fundamental demographic events that are relevant as well, and those are listed on the right. The traditional ones for study in demography, fertility, mortality, migration, of course, are all important, both in their own right and also as they lead to effects on the list of variables on the left-hand side. And in addition, I've listed a couple that are not traditionally demographic, education and health, but they're things that demographers work with so often that I'm going to include them in the list of things that are relevant when we're talking about relations between population and climate change. And last, I just want to really put in a reminder here, something that we all know, is that, of course, demography is not the only thing, nor even the most important thing, that affects either emissions or how impacts will affect society. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's a number of different dimensions of economics and economic development, consumption patterns, technology, I think, is really, for emissions, the fundamental one. We have an issue with the technology that we use to produce energy. It happens to also produce carbon. That's a problem. But culture, policies that are in place, institutional strength in different countries, all of these things play a role. So we're kind of peeling off the demography part here, and we're going to focus on that. But because we're focusing on that doesn't mean that we're therefore giving it the top place in this list of influences. So the ways that people look at relation between population and emissions, there's basically three approaches to doing this. One is looking at historical data, and there are a number of studies that have done this to get data that are available at the national level, sometimes at the city level, county level, and so on, and look at, okay, we have data for emissions over time, we have data for demographic changes over time, and also for some other variables, economic changes, technology, and so on, and do some statistical analyses to try to tease out, well, how much did the demography matter to what we've already seen? That's one way to go about it. Another way, and there have been a handful of papers taking this approach over the past, say, 10 years or so, is to look at things in what economists would call an externality framework, where you kind of look at the marginal effect of one additional person and saying, okay, for a given person born in a given country at a given time, what's our best estimate of how their typical activities during their life would lead to emissions over their lifetime, and given the prevailing fertility and reproductive rates in that country, what would be the consequences for emissions of their descendants as well. And third, and this is what I'm going to show today, is modeling aggregate future scenarios for whole countries or whole world regions or the whole world, where we use a model that represents our best thinking at the moment of how all of the different determinants of emissions matter and interact, and see how does our outlook for emissions change when we change the demographic assumptions in the model. Based on all of those types of studies, there haven't been, this is not a huge field of work. It's not tiny, but it's somewhere in between. And so broadly speaking, the kind of conclusions have been reached, if I take a big leap to summarize them in one sentence, is that if you did slow population growth, you would likely reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly. Okay, that's kind of a bland word, not very quantitative, but significantly in the long term, and also that slower population growth would probably ease adaptation to climate change as well. And therefore, as a result, from a policy perspective, policies that have the effect, whether it's their primary intention or a secondary effect of leading to lower fertility and to slower population growth, can be considered win-win from the climate point of view. The first win is that there are plenty of good reasons for those policies that have nothing to do with climate change, that have nothing to do with the environment at all, and that is the primary motivation. These are policies like education, like provision of family planning services and reproductive health services that have multiple benefits in their own right. And because they also lead to lower fertility and slower population growth, they would likely make the climate problem a bit easier to solve, and therefore there's a double benefit. So those are kind of existing, but somehow that, for 10 or 15 years has not really caught on, gained traction, sort of percolated through, I think, either in the policy world or in the research world. And I think that speaking from the point of view of climate change research that I come from, I think there are a few reasons probably for this. One is that there's a perception that these conclusions are probably true, but they're small. Yes, technically, slower population growth would reduce emissions, but it's not that big of a deal, and it pales in comparison to the influence of economic growth or technological change, and so therefore, why worry about it? The second has been that in some cases, people don't really believe the results. And they don't believe the results for a few reasons. One is that the analyses that have been done so far have been viewed as relatively simple, relatively simplistic, I guess is a better word. In particular, that they have not treated interactions between population and the economy in a sophisticated way. So you'll typically hear the argument that, well, okay, this one study found that slower population would reduce emissions, but we all know that slower population would also lead to a faster growing economy, which would wash out that effect if they had included it. Another related critique of these studies has been, another thing that's been left out is that they have only focused on population size, and that there are other things that change along with different futures for population growth, is that you will get different age structures, you'll have different urbanization rates, and all of those things will affect the outcomes as well. And until you've put that in there, then we don't really know what to make of the results of an initial analysis. And finally, and in some cases, actually, I think this is maybe the most important, is that most of the analyses of population and emissions have been done outside of the climate change research field. The people who work on modeling emission scenarios, long-term global emission scenarios, have not done that work. And the work has been done with different methods and different models that look unfamiliar. So within the climate change world, if the research is done with a model that you know about, you know the structure, you know its strengths and weaknesses, you know what context to put it in, whether to trust the result or not. And if it doesn't, you're not so sure. So because we had this interest in demographic effects, and given the lay of the landscape here in terms of previous work and how it had fared, we undertook quite a while ago, piece by piece, an analysis designed to address these issues. So for one, we're using an integrated assessment model, which is that term may not mean a lot to you, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that it is a model that's of a fairly standard structure relative to the kind of models that are used in producing global long-term emission scenarios that are used in climate change research world. So we're taking that model and we have modified it to improve the representation of demographics in it so that we can handle interactions between demography and the economy, and that we can introduce compositional change like aging and urbanization, and then use that model along with alternative demographic projections for the future, both population and numbers of households, to produce long-term emission scenarios that put together alternative demographic futures with this emissions model that can handle demography to see how much difference does it make when you add it up to the global level. What effect does changing the demography have on emissions? So I want to tell you then a little bit about each of these segments of the analysis, and then at the end show you the results. Tiger must be birdieing the fourth hole at the moment or something. So let's start with the model. The model is breaks the world into 9 different regions. So it's global coverage, but regional representation. The regions are shown up here on the map. They include 3 regions that are single countries. China, India, and the U.S. are just themselves. And then the other 6 are fairly aggregated. This is a fairly similar disaggregation of the world to many of the kinds of emissions models that are currently used. Some of them have more, some of them have 20, 25, 30 regions, but somewhere around 10 or 15 is fairly typical. Of course, the idea is to not treat everybody in the world as the same. You don't want to treat economies or the demography, the consumption patterns, the energy system, and so on of sub-Saharan Africa the same as you do for the US or the EU, so we break the world up. It's a so-called CGE model. In economic jargon, that's a computable general equilibrium model. It's a type of economic model. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the features of that type of model. And all of these regions interact through trade. The model itself is called the PET model. The Population Environment Technology Model was originally developed at Stanford by economist Larry Goulder and Mike Dalton, who I mentioned is working with us now. At that time, development was, he was a postdoc of Larry's and is now collaborating with us. So within each of these 9 regions, just want to give you a flavor of how the model works, what's going on inside it. There are basically 3 types of actors or decision units within the model. One is households, so that's kind of the demand side of the economy. Households are making decisions about how much to consume, how much to save, what types of goods to consume, and so on, in order to maximize their well-being. Producers are producing goods. There's 2 kinds of producers. The ones in the bottom left corner, the final goods producers, are actually producing the stuff that people and governments consume. The other are the intermediate goods producers, and I've broken those out here. They are the industries that produce stuff that the final goods producers use to make their goods, and importantly, that includes energy, which of course is a primary concern with what we're modeling here. All of these different parts of the economy interact. The households are actually providing the labor and the capital for producers. Producers are, of course, are selling their goods to households and to each other. The use of energy in the economy is what produces CO2 emissions. And one of the reasons I wanted to go through this is that it's important that we all have in mind that what's being modeled is not just energy used directly by households. It's not just the electricity that you're paying for to turn the lights on or the natural gas in your stove, but it's also all the energy used to produce anything that's consumed in the economy. It's the energy used to produce the house that you've built or the table and chairs that you buy and so on. So it's a complete accounting for CO2 emissions from energy within the economy. Our real novelty in the model was to take the household sector and change it so that you could represent different types of households. Typically in these models, you know, as I said, you break the world up into 9 regions, but then you treat everyone in sub-Saharan Africa the same, everyone in China the same. And we wanted to say, okay, well, to really incorporate demography, we need to differentiate a rural Chinese household from an urban Chinese household, or an old household in the U.S. from a young one, or one with 2 persons in it versus one with 7 or 10. And so we disaggregated the household side so that we could reflect different types of consumption and production behavior by different types of households. And so then when we run the model using population projections, we can see what happens when we shift most of the people in the population from, say, rural households to most of the population behaving like urban households. So, as I said, the model is designed this way in order to be able to incorporate some of the kinds of things that were left out of previous analyses. It doesn't have everything in it that one would want. So rather than putting equations up, I'm just going to list here kind of the main things that are in and a couple that are not. So there is an influence in this model of simply the population growth rate on per capita economic growth, forgetting everything else, you know, urban, rural, whatever. All else equal, if your population grows a little faster, your economy grows a little slower. This is consistent with neoclassical economic models. The effect is not strong, which is also consistent with the literature, but it does occur. Aging and urbanization, or compositional change in general, has 2 influences. One is on economic growth, on kind of the scale of the economy. If a population ages or urbanizes, can have 2 effects that affect economic growth. One is that those different households provide different amounts of labor to the economy. So the easiest example is aging. If population ages from having most people in working age groups to most people past retirement age, then you've got a lot less labor in the economy to drive production. And that affects economic growth. And when you affect the scale of the economy, you affect the amount of energy used and the amount of emissions. Also, these decisions about savings, households are making savings, which are investments in the economy, that the economy uses to grow in the future, those are simulated within the model, and they are affected by the outlook for future aging or urbanization through their effects on prices. That's another effect on economic growth. Second, there's a set of effects that happen through consumption, and this may be actually the more intuitive thing to think of, is that different types of households buy different stuff and have different lifestyles. Some types of households drive more. Some, fly more. Others use more household goods or use more household energy, direct energy consumption at the household level. And so as populations shift from younger to older or rural to urban, the kind of consumption goods that are being consumed in the economy changes. And since those goods require different amounts of energy to produce, then that can have an effect on emissions as well. So those are the principal effects that are in the model. I will mention a couple that may be important that are not in. One is that, for example, one expects in general that if you have a population scenario that has lower fertility relative to some baseline scenario that you're starting with, then you might expect that as fertility rates go down, that labor force participation by women goes up. And that would mean that there's, again, sort of the opposite of aging. You have more labor supply rather than less in the economy, and that could affect economic growth. And that is not something incorporated in the model. Similarly, we're not at the moment tracking human capital. So in particular, one can think of education levels. And one way to think of this might be we're not modeling why an alternative population future might come about. We're just testing, suppose you've got fast population growth, suppose you've got slow. Now, if you were modeling, well, how did that actually happen? One of the things that affects fertility is education. So if you were going to consider a world in which you had lower population because there was higher education, you would then also want to include an effect of, well, that increased education is going to make labor more productive and is going to increase the growth of the economy, and you're going to want to take that into account. So we're not doing that at the moment. We're just taking so-called exogenous, or things that you specify outside the model and just say, suppose population is this or it's that. We're not modeling the mechanism. Okay, so before looking at some results, I want to show you a little bit of the data that goes into it. How do we actually, use data from households today to characterize the difference in behavior of a rural household versus an urban household, and then a little bit about the population and household projections that we're using. So we'll start with the labor side. So there's kind of a labor side, production side, and a consumption side. In general, our approach was fairly painful and slow, which is to try to collect a lot of nationally representative household surveys from different countries in the world so that we could actually represent the 9 regions, disaggregate within each of those 9 regions into different household types. We're partway there. One region we had no survey data for in sub-Saharan Africa. There is some for individual countries, but it doesn't make up a big enough fraction of that region for us to use. But what you're seeing here is a sample of that data from the U.S., from our, this OIC is other industrialized countries. That means Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and then from the EU. And so this is a sample for 3 of the 8 regions for which we had household data. this shows one variable from these nationally representative household surveys for these 3 regions, which is the labor income per person by the age of the household head. So this is within households where each household is characterized by how old the household head is. So the age of the head of the household is on the x-axis, and income in US dollars is on the y-axis. And you see kind of the expected pattern that income per capita is relatively high during the younger and middle ages, and then declines sharply at older ages as people start to retire. And at that point, that's not their total income, that's just their income they're earning from labor. Older households are typically making up for at least part of that loss with income from assets or from savings. So here's something similar for developing countries. And we've plotted it a little bit different. It's all relative to the average for the country, just so that this would all fit on the same scale. You see in several countries a similar pattern of decline in labor income at older ages. It's not as sharp as in the developed countries. That's because the living arrangements are different in developing countries. More frequently at older ages, there are multiple generation households. You don't have just a couple that are both in their 70s living alone together, but they're living with adult children who are in the labor force, and therefore the per capita income of that whole household is higher. So you don't see such a drop-off at older ages. But these data are being used. This doesn't specify what happens to labor income in the future, but it does specify that whatever happens to labor income in the future in the model, the older households are going to be producing less of it, and the younger households are going to be earning more of it. And so if households, the population shifts from the left of this graph to the right, you're providing less labor to the economy. I guess I should have started off, that's actually the important point. We're using labor income as a proxy for labor supply. So this tells you how much labor are households supplying to the economy. So as populations age, you fall to the right of these graphs, and you're supplying less and less labor to the economy. Similarly, households differ on what they spend their money on. This shows, again, from these expenditure surveys, differences across our 8 regions for which we had household data in the percentage of their expenditures, of their consumption, that they're spending on 4 aggregate goods. We're aggregating all the different goods that people actually spend their money on into 4 categories that you see here in the different colors: energy, food, transport, and everything else. And you see, for example, on the left is the U.S. and other industrialized countries, relatively smaller shares of food. That's the pink bar. The other regions to the right are China, the transition countries, India, kind of aggregate other developing countries region, and Latin America and the Caribbean have a higher share of food. This is something we expect. Generally, the share of income spent on food goes down as incomes go up, so we see lower incomes. Lower income regions to the right have larger expenditure shares for food, which is what we expect. In addition, just important to keep in mind, these are disaggregated, again, not just across regions, but within regions. Here, we're just zooming in on India, showing the same thing, but within India, we're dividing households up into rural households, which are on the left. Urban households are on the right. Within rural and urban, they're then broken down by age. And in fact, there's one other dimension. This is for large Indian households, households with more than 3 people in them. I could show the same thing for small urban households, and they would differ somewhat. And you see, again, there is a difference between rural and urban, and at least in urban areas, across different age groups as well. And again, here the idea is we want to be able to simulate what happens when the number of people living in those rural households over there on the left goes down, and the number in the right in urban households goes up, and they move to older ages. This is how we're accounting for shifts in expenditures. Okay. a quick look at the population projections. Since we're using households as the unit of analysis and not just single people, we actually have to do this in 2 steps. First, produce a population projection, and then take that projected population and actually group them into different types of households. For population, we're using alternative projections from the UN, from the last time that they did long-range projections out to 2100. We're using urbanization projections that are basically from the UN, but then EASA did kind of extrapolation farther into the future of UN urbanization projections. We did our own, we being Lewen, for India and China, where we wanted to pay special attention to urbanization in those regions and be able to distinguish age structure changes and migration between rural and urban areas within those regions ourselves. And then, as I mentioned, we then produced from those household projections using a fairly standard approach, which we made some improvements to based on headship rates. I won't go into that, but that it allows us to simulate shifts in the number of people living in large households or small households over time. Okay, so here's the population projections. We use 3 alternative projections. The red lines are the global totals. These are the UN projections that I mentioned. The colored bands in between them are the amount of the difference between each global projection that is due to differences in each region. So, for example, if you look at the region between the UN medium and the UN high, there's a bunch of different bands. There's some brown shaded ones and there's some blue shaded ones. The brown shaded ones are developing country regions. So you see kind of most of the space between the 2 red lines is taken up by the brown colored bands. That is because the reason that global population is higher in the high than it is in the medium is mostly because the developing country regions have larger populations. The blue areas are the amount of the difference that's due to, for example, the U.S. being larger in the high scenario, or the EU having a larger population. So you see, as we all know, the difference in total future population growth is due primarily to differences in population in the developing countries. And again, we had to take these and then add urbanization to them and then convert them into household projections. The last thing we had to make some assumptions about before using those population projections in the PET model to produce emissions was what else is going on in the economy. So there's so much uncertainty, for example, in future rates of technological change. In particular, that's an important one, in future labor productivity growth and so on, that a typical approach to doing this is to pick a couple of different scenarios for how rapidly certain technologies may develop, or how fast the productivity of labor may grow. And we took 2 from the literature, kind of standard scenarios that people use. I'm showing here a graph actually there on the left of emissions for 2 scenarios from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have people in the room who are involved in producing those, and they developed a large set of scenarios, 6 kind of fundamental ones. 2 of them are picked out here. They're called the A2 and the B2 scenario. And they describe sort of different visions of the world. So one is one in which economic growth is very regionally oriented. It's relatively slow, but population growth is high. The pace of technological development is not that fast. The B2 is more of a medium scenario. As you can see, it's actually very conservative on the emissions that it leads to in the first 50 years. It's at the bottom of the range of scenarios out there. A2 in the first 50 years is toward the top. And this was the reason that we picked these 2. Here then are results. So this is a plot of an identical form to the population, the global population plot that we looked at. This is global emissions. First now for running the PET model with some other assumptions in it so that the world looks like a B2 scenario from back here. So this middle kind of dark gray line in the middle of the fan there is a B2 global emissions projection assuming medium population growth. That is what was assumed in the original B2 scenario. The dotted red lines are the same B2 scenario, all the same assumptions about technology and so on. The only thing that's different is that we substituted a high population projection for the top dotted line and a low population projection for the low dotted line. Now, these global emissions outcomes are aggregated from all the different regions. They all include the effect of aging, of urbanization, of changes in household size. They include interactions between demography and the economy. And this is kind of the most aggregated net result that you can get. I've marked on here just some differences in the global totals of emissions. What do they actually add up to? So if you look at the end of the century, if population follows the high path instead of the medium, you end up with 7.3. This GTC is gigatons of carbon. That's billion tons of carbon, more than you would if you were in the medium. Or if you followed the low, you'd be at 5 billion tons less. For comparison, if you see at the left-hand side of the graph around today, we're at 6 or 7. Total global emissions are 6 or 7 billion tons. So in the long run, the population path that you're on adds or subtracts something roughly equal to total global emissions today. In 2050, which is maybe a time frame we can get our heads around a little more, the effect is much smaller, somewhere around 1.5 billion tons of carbon. That is, if you move from the medium population assumption either to the high or to the low. So there's two aspects of these results I want to go into a little further. One is to take a look at what is the separate effect of the compositional change. What is the separate effect of how important is urbanization actually to this outcome? How important is aging? Just we'll take one scenario, the middle one, the B2 medium, and say, okay, that emissions go from 6 or 7 up to 10 and then up to 12 at the end of the century. How much of that is due to urbanization? And second is the aggregate totals. Are they big or small? And can we get some feeling for whether these differences in emissions actually matter? If you remember, one of the issues that I raised at the beginning for why not a lot of attention has been devoted to this has been the feeling that these are not big numbers. And so we want to, and they may not be, so we want to look at that. Okay, for completeness sake, same plot, but remember we did two sets of scenarios. It's the same thing for the A2. The A2 high scenario is the baseline, a replication of the IPCC scenario. The A2 medium is what happens to the A2 if you have medium population growth instead of the high that was assumed in that case. And you see here, because the scenario that you're starting from is a higher emission scenario, the A2 is a significantly higher than the B2, the effect of population in that scenario is bigger too. It's bigger in the long run. You end up with 11 billion tons of difference, and it's bigger in 2050. Instead of 1.5 billion tons, population makes a difference of 2.5. So if we look at the compositional effects, here's a chart that just, I won't go into how we did this, but we kind of decomposed how much of the total emissions, total growth in emissions is due to changes in individual factors of composition of the population. So if we look at the set of bars all the way on the left that's labeled A2 2050, that's in the A2 scenario, in the year 2050, here is a breakdown of 4 compositional effects. The first one is age. The fact that we included aging globally adds up for the world to an effect that reduces emissions by 1 billion tons in the world due to the effect of aging. That's primarily due to the decrease in labor supply due to an aging population. Economies grow more slowly, and you end up with 1 billion tons less carbon. The next bar is green one is the effect of changes in size. It was a little bit smaller, so I'll skip that one. The biggest compositional effect clearly was urbanization. In 2050, you have about 1.5 billion tons extra carbon due to the fact that you're accounting for urbanization relative to what would have happened if you just ignored the fact that the world was urbanizing. And the combined effect actually is pretty small because it's an offset of two fairly significant effects. In the long term, to summarize, urbanization by the end of the century is adding somewhere between 1 and 4 billion tons of carbon per year by itself, added up globally, and taking into account the uncertainty in whether the world will turn out something like the B2 or something like the A2. And aging is having a negative effect on emissions of somewhat smaller, somewhere between 1 and 2 billion tons per year in the long term. Now, as you would expect, where this stuff occurs varies by region. So I'm not going to go through this in painful detail, but the brown bars, remember, are urbanization effects. This is within one scenario breaking it down to where in the world is this urbanization leading to greater emissions. As you would expect, it's in the developing country regions. The biggest effect is in China and India, and then our large aggregated other developing countries region. Aging effects are the blue bars, and they are negative in almost all regions of the world, primarily in the industrialized countries, as you would expect, where aging is a bigger issue and will have progressed farther by that time, although there is the largest single effect in any region of aging is actually in China as well. But, China's a big country. So last, we'll switch to a final point here, are switching from the compositional effects to just the total aggregate effect of what happens if population turns out to be lower than is assumed in a baseline case. Does it add up to actually a big number? I think clearly in the long run, it's a big number. It's between 5 and 11 billion tons in this analysis. Kind of any way you slice it, as a fraction of total global emissions, in these scenarios it's about a third. Compared to current emissions, it's a big difference. In 2050, I think it's less clear, 1.5 to 2.5 billion tons of carbon per year in 2050. We want to look at that in a little more detail to say, is that big? The other thing that we want to keep in mind is that is the difference of all regions having a different population outcome. So that is not the question of what could population policy achieve. That is a question of, there are many different things. Policy is one of them, but many things that lead to different demographic outcomes. This is just saying for the whole world, every region, including places like Japan and the European Union where fertility is already low, what if it's even lower? And that may not be a policy question. If you want to think of this in terms potentially of a more policy relevant number, it's kind of up to you how you want to do that. Here's one way that we've thought about it. It's okay, let's say we take out all the regions, the industrialized country regions that already have low fertility, take out China, where fertility is already very low, and say, okay, just for now, we're not going to consider population-related policies that would affect fertility in those regions. One exception would be the U.S., because as many of you know, there's a significant degree of unwanted fertility or unmet need for contraception in the United States. So if we take just developing countries, excluding China, but then adding the U.S., that's about half of the emissions reduction. So you kind of cut this 1.5 to 2.5 number in half for 2050, and also in 2100. So, but either of those numbers, whether you cut it in half or not, is it big? One way to think about this is to compare it to the kinds of emissions reductions that some people have been calling for. Now, of course, this depends on who, right? Because some people are calling for gigantic emissions reductions and some are calling for smaller ones. Just as a starting point, we'll take what's become, I think, a fairly popular and fairly useful framework for thinking about the scale of the emissions reduction challenge. And this is so-called stabilization wedges analysis from Princeton, from Rob Socolow and Steve Piccola. And it's sketched here and this comes straight from a publication of theirs, the green line shows historical global carbon emissions. And then after the dotted line, we're going into the future. The brown line that kind of goes up and then straight is a guess at a future scenario with no climate policy of a sort of business as usual type global emissions scenario up to 2050. The blue line, which is flat from today and then goes down, is a global emissions path that would put the world on track to prevent a doubling of the atmospheric CO2 concentration, that you can think of it as putting the world on track toward avoiding at least the worst or the extreme end of climate change outcomes. Now, some people argue that's not a big enough reduction. Certainly in Copenhagen, people were aiming for something more. But remember, this is global emissions, not like the potential U.S. target, which is 80% cut by 2050. So if you wanted to say, okay, how big of a deal is that to go from the brown line to the blue line? What they did is say, well, you can divide it up into these yellow and orange colored wedges. Each wedge is defined as some activity that you start today, and it starts reducing emissions more and more each year. So you get this growing reduction that ends up in 2050 with 1 billion ton reduction per year. That's that little wedge pie slice there on the right-hand side. That's a stabilization wedge. It's an amount of reduction. In this analysis, you would need 7 of those to get from the brown line to the blue line. And so what the Princeton group did is say, okay, well, can we think of 7 things that would actually lead to a wedge of reductions between today and 2050? So they thought of 15. And so here's a wheel of reductions. And it includes a whole bunch of different things. And some of them are harder than others, but to give you a flavor for what we're talking about, so wedge 14 is stop all deforestation in the world. So that sounds challenging, okay? So now they're not all like that, but that's the size of one wedge. But another one, an end-use efficiency one, number 3, is to cut electricity use in homes, offices, and stores globally by 25%. So between now and 2050. So if we start now and by 2050 can have 25% lower electricity use in end use in residential and commercial sector globally, that would be one wedge. You know, again, that's hard, but probably doable. And you need 7 of these. Now remember, our estimate that by 2050, the total population difference would lead to 1.5 to 2.5 billion tons of reduction. So that's about 1 or 2 wedges. Even if you took the more policy relevant sort of guesstimate of half of that, which is 0.7 then to 1.2 or 1.3, then that's about a wedge. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. So that's what we're talking about. I think the utility of looking at it in this way, to me, I mean, you can argue about how many wedges you need. Some people might say, hey, we need 15, we don't need 7, and that changes the perspective. But I think that, to me, it provides a little bit of weight or specificity, at least, to the idea that probably population, slower population growth could contribute significantly, right? It's not 0. It's some significant number, but to emissions reductions, but in no way is it going to solve the climate problem, right? It doesn't even come out that it does most of it, and it could have. Right? We could have done this analysis and said, hey, more than 50% of what you need to do, you can do through population. I don't believe that you could torture a model enough to make that result happen. I also don't think you could do it and make it go away entirely. So I think when we're drawing conclusions, okay, on compositional change, we know now that, okay, that matters. We've seen some of the figures that aging and urbanization can have a significant effect, including over the next 50 years, but also over the long run. And at the aggregate level, at least from this analysis, population growth can't, slower population growth can't solve the climate problem, but it can certainly help. Most of that effect is long-term, right? The effect gets bigger in the long term. But even in the, what I would like to call the shorter term, say 50-year time horizon, the effect is significant. It is a noticeable effect. It is, you know, in the often heated and polarized debate over whether population matters to climate change, you typically get the two extremes. It doesn't matter at all, you know, or it's the silver bullet. If we just, you know, slowed population growth, not only climate change problem would be solved, but a whole bunch of environment problems would be solved. This is a somewhat modest conclusion that we've reached that is not, maybe doesn't make as good of a headline, but it's that it's a somewhat in-between result. It's neither zero nor solves the problem, but it does make a significant contribution. So thanks, and I will conclude by thanking some funders who have supported us, the top two recently, the bottom two a few years ago when we were getting started, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Terrific. Brian, thank you very much for walking us through that. It's always an audience that has people coming from a variety of different perspectives, and I think, as we can see in the participants list, we have folks coming from the climate side, from the development side, health and population side. So you certainly passed the test, which we hope all speakers do, which is to not go down into jargon in one community and make the presentation inaccessible to a diverse set of communities. So we thank you for doing that, and also further, the whole field of modeling is not one that all of us are engaged in. So we appreciate you making that so accessible. So in this sense, we have this foundation then, and with this research, to try to understand where we are going, where we might go under these different scenarios. We have obviously some interesting diversification underneath this population variable with urbanization and the aging and such. So why don't we join the conversation then with our participants here in the audience. I'll remind you that we'd like you to wait for a microphone to get to you. Let us know who you are and pose your question. Try to make it as concise as possible, and we'll go from there. So who would like to kick us off? Okay, Sean, if you could come down here, and then we'll come over here.
My name is George Pick, and I am an independent scientist. I would like to address the compositional effects on global emission. What you are saying in here is that urbanization has a positive effect, meaning that it would make things worse. However, there was not too long ago some statistics coming out of New York City where they showed that the carbon footprint of a New Yorker is one of the lowest in the country. So how do you get that two together? The other thing is I noticed that your error bar is many times bigger than your data. So I am a bit concerned that when you look at your combined effect, particularly the combined effect, your error bar essentially is way above the data resolution. So those are the two. Thank you.
Take those, Brian?
Sure. So I'm really glad you asked the urbanization effect, because I have traditionally been really ineffective at communicating this part of it, and I left it out again. So what is meant by urbanization in this analysis is it's basically everything that happens in the model when people move from rural to urban category of household. And as I showed, that is a number of things, including labor supply and also their consumption patterns. In our model, the largest effect is through labor supply. So essentially what is happening is that Although in industrialized countries, I think kind of what you're referring to, and has been shown also in some European cities as well, that the consumption effect, the difference between the energy implications of consumption of a city dweller versus energy implications of consumption of a rural dweller, actually there's lower energy per dollar of consumption in urban areas. That, number one, that consumption effect doesn't hold everywhere. And number two, the primary effect is actually a different one. It is that people are more productive, and in the specific sense of their labor makes a greater contribution to GDP growth in developing countries when they're urban versus rural. So the major reason that urbanization leads to an increase in emissions is that the economy grows faster. It's in our China region, people move from rural to urban areas, GDP grows faster, the whole scale of the economy is bigger, everybody's consumption goes up, everyone's energy use goes, and the implications of that consumption goes up, and emissions go up. So both things are in fact true at the same time. It's just that the net effect is dominated. And I think that's important because the other thing I want to say about urbanization is that I do not view the urbanization result as having a policy implication that we should slow urbanization down. It does have a positive effect on emissions in our model. If you had lower urbanization in our model, you would have lower emissions. Does that mean it's a good idea to do it? I don't think so, because there are so many benefits to urbanization. What I do think is important about it is that it helps us get the outlook right for the next few decades. Several parts of the world are going to be urbanizing rapidly, and because that provides upward pressure on emissions, we really should take that into account so that we don't get 30 years down the road and say, geez, emissions really took off. We never expected it. Why? Because we didn't have urbanization in the model, and it went much faster than we anticipated. So that's the significance I attach to it. The error bar, I think, means in a straightforward way that the combined effect is not distinguishable from zero. If that, we could go back to it, but I know exactly what you're talking about. The combined effect of the different compositional effects on emissions, because they're pointing in different directions, the net effect is very small, and the error bars include zero. So you can say, to first order, they offset each other. So if you were only interested in global aggregate totals, and you weren't going to do any scenarios where you might get surprised and the net effect turned out to be positive or negative because you ran a different urbanization scenario or a different aging one, then the things cancel each other out.
Okay. Got a couple in the middle. Kaylee, why don't we start with Jack and then come to these two gentlemen?
Thank you very much. Interesting presentation. I'm going to ask you about the other compositional element, the aging. Can you tell me what some of the assumptions are, what age people drop out of the labor force, how much their contribution to the economy declines, and how sensitive is this, say that if we raise the retirement age from current average of around 60 in many rich countries up to 70 and found that to be the case in the developing world as well, would we still see a positive effect, or is it sensitive enough that that would wipe it out?
That's a good question. The sensitivity is something that we've, for probably a year now, been saying we should check that out. To say how many years of postponement would it take to erase the effect? And if it's 1 or 2, then I think then it's not that significant, the effect, because we don't know if that's going to happen. If it's a big one, if you have to move it a lot, then it's a little more robust. So I think that's important to do. It's the reason I wouldn't, immediately say, I wouldn't say that's the most robust effect we have, for sure. And there are other effects of aging and its interaction with the economy that is a whole field of economic research. And we have done the first step, straightforward thing, which gets to the first part of your question, is that we use this labor income by household age in the base year to characterize the labor supply of that type of household. So when the model is run, the the supply of labor is exogenous over time, the whole 100 years. But instead of taking just population size as the labor supply or population size in a particular age group, we scale that by the shifts from more productive to less productive household types. So it follows exactly this kind of data that we should. Yes. So that's what we're taking. And the model does not have an endogenous labor-leisure trade-off, so that stays fixed. So total labor income is endogenous to the model because wages are being calculated within the model. But labor supply is driving economic growth according to compositional shifts over this profile of labor supply.
Okay. We had these gentlemen down here, and then we'll come over to Jason.
Hi, I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. One of the things we're interested in is making sure that all wedges be considered, and we do everything we possibly can toward driving to a more sustainable future. So my question has to do with whether or not you've looked at the cost of achieving the population wedge. Let's say that if we compare it to, say, number 12, increasing wind power 80-fold, what does that cost? How much investment does humanity have to make into that to achieve that wedge compared to a population wedge?
We have not specifically. We have just focused on the magnitude effects, like can you even get a wedge or two? But others have. And so I know that some of this has been done in the past, not exactly in the wedges framework. More recently, David Wheeler at the Center for Global Development has updated estimates and again, there aren't a lot of analyses, but they all have found that relative to other approaches, they're at the cheap end. They're at if you put this on a McKenzie-style cost curve, it comes near the low end of positive costs.
That may be the subject of some future sessions at the center, so we'll keep you up to date.
Hugh Haskell from the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. I have two quick questions. First, I wonder if you could discuss how you validated your model. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it's if I interpreted what you said correctly, you looked at POT to see if there's some kind of combined effects that may improve.
Right, that's the point of validation, is to say why should one have any confidence in the results? One is the structure of the model. So if one believes that a general equilibrium neoclassical economic framework is an appropriate structure to look at, not predicting the future, but looking at the effects of variance off of some baseline, then you have confidence in the results. So one is the structure of the model. The second is the parameter values that are important to determining these kinds of effects, outcomes, substitution elasticities, in a way you could say the treatment of aging. Those are based on the economic literature and have been estimated econometrically, some parameters better than others. So the parameter values are coming from econometric estimates that use historical data to say, when there's a price change, how easily or quickly does one industry shift from using energy as an input to labor or capital as an input, for example, or switching from one type of energy to another. So it's structure, parameter values. Of course, there's the calibration step, which is not really validation, but you are calibrating the model so that it represents many features of each of these 9 economies in the base year. So there are global data sets that we're using for GDP, economic flows in between industries, total consumption, consumption by good, by different household types that match the data. That's not exactly validation, but I put it in the category of something that helps your confidence in the results. Just to expand a little on what I think one should do more of, is that traditionally there has not been a lot of running these kinds of models to, in a true validation sense, of sort of fitting to data in 1960 and then running it for 40 years and seeing if it turns out like the world actually turned out. And there's pros and cons to doing that. It would not solve all validation problems, but I think there's more stuff like that that could be done. The cost issue or the issue of doing this within the context of other climate and energy policies is something we would like to do next. Now, the way that would work, kind of the way I see it working, is that you would run a scenario in which you said, suppose the world must limit CO2 concentrations to double pre-industrial levels. And then you run the model to say, maximize everybody's well-being, but don't have emissions so high that you go above this threshold that we've set for atmospheric concentrations. And then you do it once with, say, a medium population path, and you do it again with a low population path. Now, in both cases, emissions are going to be the same globally, because you're going to go right up to the atmospheric limit and then stay below it. So your environmental outcome is the same, but the cost is going to be different. Your energy demand is going to be lower to some degree because population is lower. And therefore, it's going to be an easier target to achieve, and the question is, how much easier? And in that case, I can imagine some interactions of scale where certain energy technologies may be viable solutions, low-carbon solutions, if they don't have to be too big or ramped up too quickly. And if you have slower growth of energy demand, essentially, driven in part by slower growth of population, then you may be able to take advantage of some of those technologies when you otherwise might not. Now, I'm not sure it turns out that way, if the effect is big enough to kind of put you over or on the other side of a particular technology threshold. But it might. So it is something that we're looking into doing.
If you could hand that microphone to a gentleman right across, Jason, and then Katie.
Jason Brennan from Population Reference Bureau. Thanks for your talk. You mentioned at the beginning that this topic hasn't gained much traction, and you listed a couple of reasons, largely that you've answered through much of your research. So my question is, you've been at this for several years and presenting various iterations of the work. Are we gaining traction, or is this issue or this contribution to emissions gaining traction? And at what levels do you see that or not see that happening? And if not, what needs to be done? We are essentially, those of us here in Washington, responsible for trying to get to policymakers with the messages. What do we need to do to help this issue gain traction?
Maybe, Brian, you could say a word about some of the places where you've had these discussions, presentations.
Yeah, so I mean, I have less to say on the policy side because, the kind of obstacles to this gaining traction in the research world, I think, are different than in the policy world. And I have less experience with this on the policy side. I think that some of the, to some degree they're related. I'm guessing, and I guess as a researcher, I'm hoping that if there were a more comprehensive and sophisticated and more solid scientific basis for, drawing conclusions about what the possible effects might be, that would actually facilitate the policy process somehow. But as we all know, there are many other things that are I don't know. I was going to say probably more important. I don't know what the relative importance is. I mean, population is a sensitive issue for a whole variety of reasons, and I don't think that certainly not one study, but even not another 10 of them is going to change that fundamentally. What I hope is that at some point in the near future, that there can be a better conversation about this. I think, and in that sense, I think that things have changed some. That for a while, you couldn't even raise the issue, and because it was so sensitive, and that a lot of the kind of argument back and forth would sort of take a scientific position as well. So if somebody who probably for other reasons just didn't think it was a good idea for population policy to be considered as part of environmental policy would argue partly on a scientific basis, like, hey, it doesn't help anyway. I hope that this kind of work can inform things, say, okay, probably as best we can tell, it would make the job easier to solve, but it wouldn't solve it entirely. And because something would help by itself doesn't make it a good idea. The fact that slowing population growth would reduce emissions doesn't mean, just on the face of it, that therefore we should do it. There's a lot of things that would reduce emissions that we think are a bad idea. And so one still needs to have that policy debate based on a whole bunch of other stuff, and including value systems, that has to take place no matter what. Now, I think we're getting to a little bit better place where and I think the main thing I would point to is Laurie Mazur's new book on population, and where there does seem to be a change in the tone of the way people talk about population-related policies, more from a rights-based perspective that can only be, made even more positive by adding the environmental benefit as well. This is fundamentally a rights issue. If we're talking about family planning and reproductive health, why are there so many women in the world, mainly in developing country regions, that don't have the same opportunities and abilities and capacity to control their reproduction the way that we do? That's a rights issue. Now, it's useful to know that then there is also probably an environmental benefit to following through on that rights issue, but this by itself is not going to kind of change the fundamental debate, I don't think.
Jeff, can I ask a really quick follow-up question?
Okay, yeah, I have one too. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, do you feel comfortable with policy advocates using your research to make the case for increased funding for family planning?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm not the one making the case. I think as long as it's used in a responsible way, then it's fine. I also would be comfortable with someone who wanted to argue against funding for family planning, or arguing against the environmental benefit argument, to say, hey, it's only one wedge. It's not like it's going to solve the problem. And then, then those people can fight out whether that is a big enough magnitude to worry about or not.
Can I follow up? You alluded to it, but then didn't go in as much detail just in your answer to Jason about the change in receptivity to including these variables from your climate modeling colleagues, and whether you see a change there as to whether these insights are ones that they're willing to bring on and start integrating into their modeling endeavors.
Yes, and that's true mainly in the compositional effect issue. And I think there is growing interest in urbanization. There are a couple of models who are incorporating urbanization right now. It's not in quite the same way. It doesn't enter the model on the driving emissions side. It's kind of used afterwards to say, once we've done our scenario of emissions without urbanization as an explicit driver, now let's downscale kind of where is the energy consumption taking place, how much of it is in urban areas, how much is in rural areas. So there are a lot of, and I think this is a very positive development, because I think one of the real benefits of treating compositional effects is actually that it provides a very good way and a natural way to address both parts of the population interaction with climate, which is part of it is on the impacts and related to development issues. So if you're looking at traditional biomass use in households in developing countries and health implications, well, that's traditionally not done in these large integrated assessment models because they run at too aggregated level. But if you're distinguishing households, and we're, for example, adding income distribution to household types, and you can go in and look at, we're simulating projections of traditional biomass use by relatively poor rural or poor urban households, you can then start doing analyses that are not only what is the outlook for aggregate emissions in India over the next 30 years, but under a particular energy policy, what would also be the implications for health at the household level due to some kind of energy subsidy or tax or carbon tax or something like that. So I think the interest is being driven mainly by these compositional issues. People are always interested in new updates to the outlooks for population growth, whether those are shifting over time, are they capturing the full range of outcomes. I would just say they're not so interested in doing analyses that are really policy analyses of what role could population play in policy. I don't see that really taking off.
Okay, Kathleen?
Thanks a lot, Brian. I'm Kathleen Mokelgard from Population Action International, and I had a couple of technical questions for you. If we could talk for a minute about the B2 scenario from the special report on emission scenarios, which, if I understand correctly, one of the major critiques of that was that it took into account only population size and didn't look at the kinds of compositional effects that you've been talking about. And I wondered if you could tell us to what extent the original B2 scenario, which I think uses the medium long-range population projection, how far off, does this research show us how far off the original emissions from the B2 scenario were because they did not account for these compositional effects?
That's a good but somewhat complicated question. Fortunately, Hugh Pitcher is sitting behind you who blame him for the B2. He was part of the team that developed it. And Hugh, you may want to say something. I would start by saying that, so, I mean, there are many different B2 scenarios. So the B2 is a storyline. It's a qualitative description, some quantification of a few things like population of one possible global development path. And then a bunch of different models took that storyline and the population path and a couple other things and did their own projections of how emissions would turn out. So I think there were, in the original IPCC team, I think there were 6 models. So there were 6 different versions of B2. One was picked to sort of be the representative so that we don't always have to show 6, we'll just show 1. That's the one I'm showing here. I think that one was an EASA model scenario, I think the B2 was. So the point is that what emissions are B2 emissions is, there's not a single answer to that, because the 6 different models produced a range of outcomes on what they thought emissions would turn out to be, given this qualitative description about development paths. The compositional effects, I think that, to some degree, yes, although I think it would be one thing among several that would lead to differences in emissions outcomes across different models who tried to do their own version of B2. So if I remember, urbanization, for example, is 1 to 2 billion tons of carbon compositional effect in the B2 by the end of the century. The B2 itself is somewhere around 12. And that's, so one model, you could say, would have ended up with 13 or 14 billion tons of carbon instead of 12 if they had left out urbanization by the end of the century. Another model might have ended up with, 13 or 14 or 15 just because they had a different model and a different structure and a different assumption about how economic growth would influence energy choices and so on, which would reflect a different aspect of uncertainty, not in the composition effect, but in an energy system effect. So I think that it's not, I don't think the composition effects that we found here would fundamentally, revise the story for either the B2 or the A2 or anything. But it is, I think it's important, one, because it is an element of uncertainty like others that are treated, and there's no reason this one shouldn't be. And for urbanization, I think that it's a bigger deal over the next few decades, is that if we want to try to get a better idea, and really not even so much just like a scenario, but it's a semi-prediction of, where are we headed over the next 10 or 20 years in the absence of policy, I do think we need to, if we leave out urbanization there, that's a bigger problem.
Kathleen, did you have another question? You said you had two.
I did have another question. I hope it's okay if I ask it quickly. I'm trying to still get my head around kind of how the slower population growth aspect of your argument contributes to the compositional changes. If we're not talking about just population size, but is it easy to describe in concrete terms how slower population growth contributes to perhaps slower urbanization or different ways that household size changes or aging? If you could say a little bit about the connection between slower population growth and the kinds of compositional changes that are having an effect on emissions.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I'm sort of making this case that's part of the value added of the scenarios here. It's like, well, ours include aging, urbanization, and so on. And so the way that works is if you start with one scenario, B2, medium population growth, you do your emissions projection, and now you say, okay, what happens if there's slower population growth? Well, in the slower population growth, that in the UN scenario happens primarily because fertility is lower. That leads to more aging. So it's not only a slower population growth, but it is an older scenario as well. Household size changes as well, at least due to simply the change in age structure. Older households in most regions of the world tend to be smaller. So you shift not only to older households, but to smaller ones as well. And that's different from your baseline. Urbanization, one could imagine a story in which, faster urbanization was occurring consistent with a faster fertility decline. We didn't do that because we thought, well, there's other stories you could tell too. Let's not get too complicated. So we left the percentage of each population that's urban over time the same between the medium and low scenarios. That implies, of course, different size urban populations and rural populations because the total size is different. And it would imply different migration rates. But we did not change urbanization as well. It was kind of a flip of a coin because we thought in having this conversation, we could either say, all right, this is an urbanization effect and we didn't mess with urbanization, or we could say we did mess with it and now we have to argue about did we mess with it in the right way. And, do you believe that we should have higher urbanization every time we have lower fertility? Would that be, required to believe, the end result? Probably in the end it would be better to do it both ways and see if it makes that big of a difference. But that's how the compositional effects come into play when you're changing the aggregate just population growth scenario.
We had a question over here, and then we'll go to the middle.
Thank you. Marisa Lino from Northrop Grumman. And first of all, I wanted to say I'd rather listen to you than watch Tiger Woods any day. I was struck by something you said just a few moments ago in talking about the policy issue, in that you feel uncomfortable talking about policy options. And I would venture to say that as uncomfortable as you feel in talking about policy options, a policymaker would feel equally uncomfortable talking about the mathematics and science of modeling. Pretty simplistic statement. But I think it points to one of the central issues, and it's something that my corporation is working on, and that is the gap between science and policymaking. Because it's not that policymakers want sound bites so much as they want an answer that is perhaps certified by the government and as the best possible answer at the moment. Not that anyone is ever expecting to have a perfect answer always, but something that is easily understandable by the non-scientist. it's just my comment. I've had a lot of math and computer stuff, so I can follow what you're saying, and I thought your presentation was clear. But I'm trying to imagine, say, an undersecretary in a government department understanding what it is that needs to be done, or somebody at USAID, there are a lot of aid people here, that needs to be done using the information coming. And I know you're not done with all of your work, but I think one of the problems we need to grapple with is this gap between science and policymaking.
Thank you. Well, that's something coming from a former ambassador who sat on both sides of these. Maybe, Brian, can I piggyback on that and say, you've participated in a number of fora where it is this mix of science and policy folks. Have there been characteristics of those processes where you see it working, whether because it's small in the same group over time and you have the ability to start learning each other's languages and see where it's coming from, or are there kind of common characteristics, or certainly EASA has a lot of experience in working with those communities and NCAR as well, but are there kind of best practices that you've seen emerge from bridging these worlds?
I think that, you know, I think one important thing is and this is sort of important to any kind of issue that cuts across disciplines or science and policy and so on, is that it is a problem when people kind of assume they know what the deal is with the other segment, you know, of people, whether it's a political issue or a scientific issue. And I think that population suffers from that because this is pure speculation. This is my best guess, is that people feel like they have some experience with it, right? They've had kids, or they were a kid, they were from a family. They know why people have children and why they don't. And that and this is true for kind of any population-related issue you can think of. And that somehow kind of easily translates into, I know what the, you know, whether family planning programs of certain kinds would be effective or not. Because I think, I know why people have children. Would that have made a difference? No. Okay. So no, I don't believe that. Without knowing that, or without stepping back and saying, okay, not everybody's like me. My personal experience does not represent the world and the past 40 years. And there's a whole field of people who have looked at this for decades, just like they have, you know, in a straight science field, in climate science field. But somehow that connection is not naturally made. What you would want is to say, okay, I may have an opinion, for starters, but tell me what you know about this. You know, what do we know so far? You know, what is the evidence related to different policy options, and then to have a discussion like that. And I think that is fostered by having more sustained interaction between communities. And I think with a lot of things, it depends on individual people, is finding a few individual people to start with who can participate, you know, and it takes time to participate in discussions, events like this, projects and so on, where people from the policy side and the science side, or from different social and natural sciences, are involved over time, so that there can be a kind of, it's capacity building, really, over time. So, and just to go back to something that you said earlier, just to be clear, I'm not uncomfortable talking about policy options. I guess at some point I am, because I know I reach the limit of my knowledge and kind of what I know about. And then I feel, yeah, I guess uncomfortable is a word for it. More like, you don't know what you're talking about, so maybe you should shut up now. It's that kind of feeling. I do think that in climate change research in general, sort of at research meetings, that people may be uncomfortable with it because this is an applied field. Integrated assessment modeling exists in order to evaluate applied policy questions for the climate change world. And while we've talked about, and some people have asked about, the the argument that the climate-related environmental benefit of lower fertility is a valid argument for family planning and reproductive health programs. That's one thing. If you start from the climate change perspective and say, well, does this work support including family planning services as a climate policy option so that a country could either cut their emissions by investing in the energy system or invest in their family planning program and say, okay, we haven't seen the reductions yet from slower population growth, but hey, this contributes to lower emissions, so shouldn't these be treated on an equal basis? To me, that's a kind of qualitatively different thing. And I think many people have that intuitive feeling, and so it makes them sensitive to even starting down the road of doing research on it, or talking about it at a meeting where someone else is presenting modeling results on the implications of better end-use efficiency, and then you want to stand up and say the implications of improved access to family planning and reproductive health. People automatically think, oh, you must want us in the climate policy arena to show up at Copenhagen and start talking about population, or try to get population into a tradable permit system, and that is not the same thing. I personally think that would be a terrible idea. And so in that case, I'd be uncomfortable with someone else using the work for that argument, because to me, it doesn't turn on whether it would actually produce emissions in the long run or not. That doesn't have much to do with whether it's a good idea or not.
There's a question in the middle right there.
Hi, I'm Lee Rowan from ICF International, and I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the urbanization part that you mentioned earlier, and I had two questions related to that. The first one is how you're distinguishing between urban and rural, and whether there's any spatially explicit information in the model that you're using. And then my second question was just how can you be sure that urbanization is a driver of emissions instead of just being correlated with economic growth?
Okay, so yeah, those are both good questions. So urbanization in our model means, yeah, it's very specific. It's a classification of household types, and urban is different from rural to the extent that labor supply and consumption patterns in household surveys differ between households that in those surveys are defined as rural or urban. That's the difference. So in India, for example, for large households, just taking expenditure shares, this is the difference between urban and rural. Right? So urban means households that prefer goods according to the graph on the right. Rural means households that prefer goods according to the graph on the left. And then there's a similar one for labor supply. Rural and urban differ in that. In the model, that is all that the model knows about an urban household or rural household. There isn't a spatial component to it. We are separately in the process of developing a spatial population model to either to downscale a kind of given urbanization projection to where people are actually living, or to actually do it at a spatial scale in the first place. But right now, in these results, it's not. And therefore, and this is the reason it's important, is that when we say urbanization, that's all it means in here. So it doesn't mean what is the effect of someone who in all other respects is the same, but simply geographically moves to live in a different place. That's not what it means. It means that for whatever reason, and typically these are reasons that are associated with people who live in, set of reasons associated with urban populations versus rural, they behave differently in terms of their economic characteristics. What was the last part of your question? Because I know there was one more.
I was talking about correlation versus causality, or the relationship between urbanization and economic growth and emissions.
Right, and I think that probably there, things definitely happen in both ways, right? People with the same set of skills, applying them within an urban framework, urban environment versus rural environment, depending on the country. Now here I'm really thinking in developing country settings, have a different effect on GDP. Part of this is also implicit, like we're not really modeling every single process. So the fact that if someone moves from a rural area to an urban area, partly, even if they're doing the same thing, their contribution to GDP may be higher. Partly, they will relatively quickly over time do new things rather than what they were doing in the rural area. That will make a larger contribution to GDP. We're not modeling that explicitly, but it's a kind of implicit assumption. And then the reverse direction of, well, if GDP is growing faster, that may drive urbanization, migration, is certainly true, right? There are models that model this endogenously, typically by differences in wages between rural and urban areas as a driver. We're kind of doing this in an implicit way where we're saying, well, for a scenario in which GDP is growing a certain amount, here's a level of urbanization that would be roughly consistent with that. Then we're explicitly modeling the part of the GDP growth that's driven by urbanization. We're explicitly modeling that. But we're not, for example, modeling, I would say, most of the other forces that are driving urbanization. That's imposed from the outside. We just have this urbanization scenario. In a way, you could think of this as, on the driver's side, as kind of, in the final scenario, decomposing the economic growth into the amount driven by urbanization versus the amount driven by something else.
Okay, Heather, we'll give you the final question. Heather Diagnos.
Hi, I'm Heather Diagnos, and I'm with USAID. So I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's not really a policymaker, but maybe is trying to think about how policymakers would think about this. And, trying to wrap my feeble brain around it a little bit. So I have two questions. The first is, I think, an easy one. The second one might be a bit harder. The first is, you had mentioned in the beginning of your talk that you do not incorporate into this model things that might drive population, like education, or even I could possibly think that women's participation in the labor force might drive that too. So the first question is there an opportunity to incorporate that into future models, maybe that you're doing or others? And then the second question is, in a lot of the discussions I've been a part of when you talk about future population projections with emissions, there's a perspective of many that future emissions will be driven by those in the developed countries and not so much by the developing. And so it was interesting to see in your A1 and B3 breakdown by region that actually it's not so predominant in the developed versus the developing. And so I was wondering if the reason for that is that you're seeing the aging effect in the developed, which is impacting, and then in the developing you're seeing the economic growth and urbanization effect.
Okay, let me start with the last one, the second one. And yeah, this is important, and I didn't stop to point it out, but of course, one of the reasons for doing this analysis is that it's not just population that matters; it's consumption levels, economic growth, and so on. Those per capita emissions in the real world and in our model are much higher in industrialized countries now and for decades into the future than they are in developing countries. That's all true. Alternative population paths, the biggest change in population is in developing countries, but those are regions that currently and in the future have relatively low per capita emissions. So how does it all add up? That's kind of the point. So here, you can see, as we talked about before, that the brown areas are, the brown shaded are the developing country areas. account for most of the population difference between scenarios, between our alternative population scenarios. So the blue areas are the industrialized country, how different population turns out between the medium and the high, or the medium and the low. And if we look at the same thing for emissions, then we actually see now the blue areas account for a disproportionately large fraction of the difference in emissions. And that is because they have higher consumption levels, higher per capita emissions, really throughout the century. So there's sort of two stories. You still see that when you are in the B2 scenario, and you go from the medium to the low population assumption, at least half, probably more than half of the emissions reductions come from the developing country regions. So in that sense, you know, there's sort of the biggest story is from the developing countries. From the other point of view, the contribution from the industrialized countries is actually pretty significant, and it's much, much more significant than population differences would lead you to believe. It's a very small population change. It has a very big effect on emissions outcomes. So one can look at this from both points of view. And as I said, was one of the points of trying to work out, you know, how does this all add up? Because it's true, consumption levels differ, population patterns differ as well. This is somewhat scenario dependent. This is how it works in the B2 scenario. Here's A2. Actually, it kind of turns out pretty similar in the A2. One could construct scenarios, I'm sure, where the mix of where reductions are coming from would be different. Your first question about could these things that are not in the model be added is yes. So in education, we're doing that now. Working with EASA, they produce education projections for the world. So we wanted to do that and say, okay, you produce a population projection where there's an assumption about changes in enrollment rates, and you project, again, the composition of population by numbers of people at different levels of education over time. They produce them with education effects on fertility. So that is done then by the population group at EASA. And then we would use them in the model where we take into account the effect of changing education on labor productivity and economic growth and see how it works out. So that is being done. The female labor force participation and, as was raised earlier, the old age labor force participation are, I would say, the easiest things to do and the ones we have not started doing yet, but are very doable. So if anybody has, like you say, an economics grad student or economic demographer grad student who wants to do a perfect project, just have them send me an email.
And Boulder, Colorado. I mean, where else would you want to be? Okay. Well, Brian, thank you very much. Thank you for some excellent questions from the.
Thanks for the question.